and welcome back. Today we're looking at Chapter 10, Section 3, New Threats from Overseas. And our essential question for today, the thing that we're going to be talking the most, is what were some of the international threats that the United States faced in the years after the American Revolution? Now, I know if you are like Ron Swanson, that you like to think that history officially began on July 4th, 1776, but there were some other things going on in the rest of the world at this time, and we're going to look at some of those. So, as you can see, I've already done audio recordings for each section of today's lesson, so if you want to use those instead, you're more than welcome. Or if you would like to just go through and read through the lesson on your own, feel free to do that as well. But if you want to stick with this video recording, then let's keep moving on. So let's take a look at our key terms for today. All right, our key terms are tribute, and this is in the sense of a bribe, impressment, embargo, which leads to the Embargo Act, smuggling, and we will end today talking about the Non-Intercourse Act. All right, so let's move into today's discussion. All right, so I know that we've been talking about Thomas Jefferson, but I want us to get back in our minds and kind of rewind a little bit to the years right after the American Revolution, the late 1700s. All right, you in there? Okay, good. So in the years following the American Revolution, American overseas trade grew very rapidly, and American, or Yankee, as a lot of them were known, captains, were constantly looking for new markets. Traders would take ice from the Great Lakes and from up in New England all the way out to India, and were really able to build up a profitable trade with India, Great Britain, France, as well as all the way out to China. And we're actually looking at a picture of a U.S. ship known as the Empress of China leaving New York Harbor in 1784. And more than 10 years before Lewis and Clark, Yankee traders sailed up the Pacific coast to try and trade with Indians living in that area, as well as Spanish settlers in that area. And so many traders from Boston visited the Indians in that area that they ended up calling every white man that they ran into Boston. Traders would buy furs from the Indians and then sell them for very large profits in China, among other places. These trade routes were not without their risks and dangers, especially in the Mediterranean Sea. In the Mediterranean, sailors had to deal with, among other things, pirates. So to protect American ships, the United States would pay a tribute, or a bribe, to the rulers of the Barbary States. And the Barbary States, if we look on this map, were located on the northern coast of Africa. And that's where a lot of these Mediterranean pirates were coming from. So the U.S. government would pay a tribute to the governments of these nations to kind of say, hey, here's some money, so leave us alone, okay? And then the Barbary States would be like, oh, sweet, thanks. We'll leave you alone. But in 1801, one of the Barbary States, Tripoli, increased its demands, and Jefferson just flat out refused to pay. So Tripoli declared war on the United States. So in return, the United States blockaded its port. Now, during this blockade, we're looking at a picture of the blockade right now. The USS Philadelphia ran aground near Tripoli. So to avoid Tripoli using the Philadelphia for a future surprise attack, naval officers set fire to the ship while American Marines marched in to attack Tripoli. And in 1805, a treaty was signed by the ruler of Tripoli promising no longer to interfere with American ships. But it really wasn't until 1815 that the United States was able to achieve its final victory over the Barbary States. And it is from this war with the Barbary States, I feel like I've said Barbary States a lot, but it's from this is why the first verse of the Marine Corps hymn starts with the lyrics, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli."
For many years, trading ships that sailed off the north coast of Africa, where the Sahara Desert meets the Mediterranean Sea, were harassed by pirates from the Barbary States, today's countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Trading ships were required to either pay the Barbary States for protection or else have their cargoes seized and their crews held for ransom. In fact, by the time Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801, the U.S. government had already paid out $10 million in protection money. That was why President Jefferson ordered American naval vessels to the Mediterranean Sea. They included this famous ship, the USS Constitution. At first, the war centered on the city of Tripoli, whose harbor was blockaded and shelled by U.S. warships. During the blockade, one American ship, the Philadelphia, was captured and then destroyed. The war with Tripoli ended after 4 years of fighting, but it wasn't until 1815 that the United States achieved a final victory over the Barbary States.
American neutrality is violated. Now, we mentioned in an earlier section, actually mentioned in a few earlier sections, that American ships faced another problem, especially when Britain and France went to war with each other in 1803. Now, at first, American ships were actually able to make a profit because they would trade with Great Britain and with France, but neither side, neither Britain nor France, wanted America trading with its enemy. So France began seizing American ships that were trading with Britain, and Britain stopped traders on the way to France. And from 1805 to 1807, hundreds of American ships were captured either by France or Britain. Remember Jay's Treaty? Yeah, that's this time period. Now, because they were running out of people in their navy, Great Britain actually stepped up an act called impressment. An impressment is when the government forces people into military service. So with their own people, gangs would raid British villages, and British ships would seize British sailors serving on American ships. They would take the British sailors, take the British soldiers, and force them to fight in the British Army or the British Navy. Now, because they were taking from British ships as well as American ships, many American-born sailors were also taken, and this caused many to call for war against Great Britain. And think about it. At this point, it wasn't even 30 years since the end of the Revolutionary War. And now, Great Britain was stealing American sailors and putting them to work on their own ships. Now, how would you have felt if you were living in the United States at this time and you hear about Great Britain taking American sailors from American ships and forcing them to fight for the British? I don't think I would be very pleased either. So Jefferson knew that the tiny American naval fleet was no match for either France or Great Britain. But he also knew that something had to be done to stop British and French sailors from taking American sailors. And he had hoped that an American embargo would hurt France and Britain by cutting off their supply lines. An embargo is a word that means a ban on trade. So by setting up the embargo, trade is no longer allowed with any foreign nations. And the United States was actually growing economically because of foreign trade, but Jefferson hoped that by placing an embargo on trade, it would help to keep the United States neutral. That was George Washington's foreign policy that he expressed at the end of his presidency, and Jefferson wanted to maintain that policy of neutrality. So the Embargo Act did hurt Britain and France economically, but the country that was hurt most by the Embargo Act was the United States, because supplies of sugar, tea, molasses, all these things that were important to the American economy were cut off. I mean, sure, Great Britain and France were missing out on some valuable American goods, but the economies of both of those nations had been very, very well established, and so they were able to kind of weather the storm of no longer having American goods. For the U.S., exports dropped by more than $80 million in just 1 year, and merchants from all the way from New England all the way down to the South were hurt, with some resorting to smuggling, which is importing or exporting goods in violation of trade laws, so illegally importing and exporting goods. And Jefferson ended up using the military to try and enforce the embargo, and several smugglers ended up fighting federal troops, so it was just all around not a good time for the American economy. And by 1809, Jefferson was willing to admit that the Embargo Act, he tried his best, but the Embargo Act was a failure. So he asked Congress to sign a much milder Non-Intercourse Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act would allow Americans to trade with other nations, just not Britain and France. The Embargo Act, like I said before, had forbidden trade with any foreign nation, and it ended up throwing the country into a pretty serious economic depression. But now, under the Non-Intercourse Act, trade was resumed. It just avoided Britain and France. So the original intent of the Embargo Act was preserved. And the Embargo Act as a whole ended up being the single most unpopular part of Jefferson's presidency. But as a whole, he was still a pretty popular president, and the Republican Party stayed strong even with the Embargo Act. And Jefferson's enormous popularity dropped some because of the Embargo Act, but he was able to remain popular enough to help his close friend James Madison become elected. And just like Washington, Jefferson chose to only run for 2 terms and not run for a 3rd term. And in 1808, Jefferson's good friend, the Republican James Madison, won the election pretty easily. And Madison had hoped that Britain and France would soon agree to respect American neutrality, but there were conflicts brewing within the borders of the United States that were going to challenge that neutrality. And in our next lesson, we're going to look at these external conflicts as well as the internal conflicts would lead to America's Second War for Independence. Yes, you heard me correctly, the Second War for Independence.
Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars begin to interfere with America's expanding shipping industry.
It was a lose-lose situation of how to negotiate the troubled waters in the Napoleonic Wars. It's important to keep in mind that the Jeffersonians, as much as the Federalists, were determined to maintain neutrality. So the dilemma for Jefferson is that belligerent talk and the effort to vindicate neutral rights went for him hand in hand with a failure to prepare.
In the interim, what Jefferson sought to do was to impose an embargo. And that put the Customs Service in a very difficult position because, of course, they saw themselves as developing and articulating what this commercial republic was and how it ought to develop further and prosper. And yet here was Thomas Jefferson saying we had to put essentially restrictions on that by imposing an embargo.
The embargo triggers a serious economic depression. Hardest hit are the merchants and ship owners of the Northeast, most of them Federalists.
It's one of the great tragic set pieces of American political history. It led Jefferson into wholesale invasions of civil rights and liberties, trying to keep Americans from trading abroad. It was logistically impossible and required the use of federal power in the court systems in a way that was effectively nullified throughout much of New England. In fact, Jefferson's reverence or respect for local self-government was reinforced by New England's resistance to his embargo. But of course, the ultimate disaster was that that war came nonetheless, and it was called Mr. Madison's War, but it was really Mr. Jefferson's war.
The election of James Madison as president in 1808 continues the procession of Republican presidents from Virginia, although the Federalists capture an increased number of votes. In his final days in office, Jefferson signs a bill to lift the embargo.
Jefferson dealt in large generalities and in principles that he didn't question deeply. Madison went over those in detail, and he had a quizzical mind, and he kept chopping up these questions into small pieces and trying to figure out the intricacy of them in ways that Jefferson and no other person at the time really did. He was the foremost intellect of that era. However, unlike Jefferson, he was not a good administrator. He was not a very good politician.
The politician in the Madison family is the president's wife, Dolly.
She had a warm, accessible personality. She was very charming. She was very social. And her husband, James Madison, was almost the opposite. He was very shy. Often people wouldn't even notice him at his own parties. I think it's a clue that they were very similar in height, but everybody describes Dolly Madison as this sort of larger-than-life figure, and James Madison as this sort of tiny, wizened little schoolmaster who looked like he just whipped one of his schoolboys. He seems the embodiment of the sober, virtuous Republican. But Dolly Madison does all the political stuff that the country needs.
Indian uprisings, encouraged and supported by British agents in Canada, and the cutoff of trade with Europe, pushed the nation toward conflict with Great Britain.
Congress was divided over whether or not to declare war on Great Britain. And in fact, it was this issue that resulted in the congressional overturn of 1810, which replaced some huge proportion of the members of Congress, and there was a new group in town, the War Hawks, led by John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, and they wanted war. James Madison, for the most part, did not want war, but it became clear to some people, including to Dolly Madison, that he would never win the presidential election of 1812 unless he did.
There's some reason to think that the embargo and later now non-intercourse acts did have a long-term effect on the British, and that the British were getting ready to deal. They withdrew their orders of council just before the Americans declared war.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, today we're going to be working on a very important skill for studying history, and really for studying anything, and that is having the ability to synthesize information. In history, I hope that we've learned that history is more than just reading a textbook. And it's more than just studying so that we can do well on tests. But we study history so that we can learn from our mistakes, and we can learn from the good things as well as the bad things from our past to hopefully help us grow as people. And we do that by taking information from different sources and bringing it together to make conclusions. So to synthesize information, we use the following steps. First, we identify the sources, and we've talked about this some in our lessons when we talked about looking at different forms of artwork, of knowing the artist and knowing what he or she was trying to portray. So we identify the sources. We know knowing the background of a writer or the source of a graph or statistics helps us to evaluate the information, and it also evaluate the validity and know of any bias that may be present in that source. So the second thing that we do is we identify key facts and ideas. We look at these sources, we look at this evidence, and then try to pull out the key points that are being made. And what are the main points that the writer is trying to get across? From that, we move on to analyzing that evidence. We examine and compare the sources of evidence, graphs, statistics, letters, pictures, paintings, look at the sources of the evidence that we're using. So we analyze that evidence, and then we take all of this in step 4 to draw our conclusions. We use the different pieces of evidence to form a conclusion. And now that we know these 4 steps to take, let's look at today's assignment. Today's assignment, we're going to be looking at this letter and this graph, and they deal with President Jefferson's attempt at keeping America neutral by imposing the Embargo Act. And we want to use the information in and about the letter, as well as the graph, to answer the questions and follow through the steps of synthesizing our information. So first, let's look at the letter. And this letter was sent by a person living in New England to President Jefferson, and it's specifically about the Embargo Act, and it's quoted from a book, A Diplomatic History of the American People. And the letter goes something like this: "You infernal villain, how much longer are you going to keep this cursed embargo on to starve us poor people? One of my children has already starved to death, which I am ashamed, and died of apoplexy. I am a Federalist." So that is the letter we're going to be using. And then moving over here to the graph, the y-axis represents exports in millions of dollars, and the x-axis is, as you can see, years. So it shows the growth and decline, what American exports look like from year to year. So each point on the graph represents a different year. So 1800, 01, 02, 03, 04. And you can see that it's growing and dipping, but it grows to its highest point by 1808. But between 1808 and 1809, there's a very drastic drop. Why do you think that might be? But I also want you to know that this graph is taken from a book called Historical Statistics of the United States. All right, now for the actual assignment. We're going to use the letter, the graph, and what we learned from this lesson on section 3 to answer the following questions. Each question is going to follow the 4 steps that we listed: identifying the sources, identifying key facts and ideas, analyzing the evidence, and drawing a conclusion. And each set of questions will be worth 4 points, making this total assignment worth 16 points. So in number 1, we need to identify the sources. Who wrote the letter? How did the writer feel about the embargo? And what is the source of the graph information? Number 2, identify the key facts and ideas. Restate the main point of the letter and describe the changes in the value of exports shown in the graph. Number 3, analyze the evidence. Based on the lesson, why did American exports fall sharply after 1807? Part B, how does the graph explain the writer's point of view? How does the graph show what the writer is saying? And number 4, based on the evidence in the letter, the graph, and the lesson, I want you to come to one conclusion about American trade in the early 1800s. This is your educated guess. Based on all of this evidence, what do you see that kind of ties this all together? Something that you can say about American trade in the early 1800s based on the letter, the graph, and the information described in the lesson. All right. Now, while you're working on this, you can also refer to the marking guide to see how you will be scored. But I'm going to be following each of these 4 points, so you need to give me information for each of these points and then bring it all together to draw your conclusion about American trade in the early 1800s. All right. Well, with that having been said, I'm going to end this recording, and I hope to hear from you very soon if you have any questions, or just to say, "Hi, Mr. Huebner, how you been?" All right, have a great rest of your day, and good luck.